Hello, my name is Dan Brook. I'm delighted to be with you again, along with our esteemed colleagues that will introduce themselves shortly. This is another in the series of different voices, shared visions. We've been on the air now for 5-6 years. The thing that has drawn us together is that the three religions represented are all part of the Abrahamic religions, namely all three religions, the Jewish faith, the Christian faith, and the Islamic faith, all count Abraham as our father. And from that same source, the three religions have grown. The three religions together are predominant religions on the planet. Today we're going to do something a little different because depending upon who you listen to, we are at the beginning of Ramadan. If you're watching this in the next number of days, as you see your Muslim friends, be sure and greet them with Ramadan Mubarak, as we say to our wonderful and gifted friend, Dr. Kilich, who we're going to ask to introduce himself shortly and tell us a little bit about Ramadan, since the amount that we have grown up with learning about it is usually fairly insignificant to being predominantly Christian culture. Even though, as I think you'll remember we mentioned before, that even before the revolution, it was predominantly Muslims from Turkey and Jews from Eastern and Central Europe on the East Coast that established our capitalistic system, and were predominantly responsible for the kind of country we are now, at least economically. So we have sometimes overlooked that history, and we're grateful for it and grateful for the point it's brought us to today. Our conversation, however, once we get started, has to do with the concept of inclusion. It's a relatively recent word. It only goes back to the early 15th century. Comes from a Latin word, the Latin word en and claudare, meaning basically to have someone or something as a constituent part, a part of the whole. And we're living in a time where inclusion has become a kind of a nasty word to some. A lot of energy is expended on keeping people out rather than making or enjoying or inviting people to be a constituent part of the whole. And so our conversation eventually will get to that. But right now, I'd like to ask Dr. Kilich to tell us a little bit about Ramadan, how it begins, when it begins, its purpose, things of that sort. And then if you would introduce the person next to you, the pastor, Reverend Dean Simpson, who would then introduce the person next to him, a lawyer, Rob Wertheimer, and we'll get this conversation going.
Thank you very much. I'm Özcan Kilich, and I'm originally from Turkey. Now it's our 13th year here in this region. We used to live in River Falls. Last year we moved to Woodbury. So Ramadan, thank you very much for bringing this up. And Ramadan is a blessed month, the 9th month of the year in Islam. And it's a month of fasting. That's what it says. And Muslims who believe and practice their faith, they start from from dawn to dusk, fasting, where they stop eating. They can't eat anything, no drinking, and actually no sexual intercourse as well. So those are three forbidden aspects of during the Ramadan when you fast. The Ramadan is kind of a physical detox, but at the same time also a spiritual detox, which means we don't just not eat and drink. We also try to reflect on our past year, reflect on what we did, reflect on what we couldn't do, and try to repent during those 30 days of fasting. By thinking positively and not talking bad things, cursing, or doing bad things to others. Usually, during the Arabs, there was 4 months where fighting was forbidden, and Ramadan is one of the 4 months. So any violence is forbidden, any bad actions and bad deeds are forbidden as well, besides this physical fasting of not eating and drinking. So, and during the month of Ramadan, the Quran was revealed. Usually, it's been said that during the 29th night of Ramadan, the last 3-4 days, the Quran was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam by the Archangel Gabriel. And that also makes the month of Ramadan more holy. And I hope that with all these thoughts, this month will bring all the good blessings to us, to the Muslims, and to the whole world as well, and contribute to the peace between everyone. So let's conclude this way. Thank you. Now I'd like to introduce Dean Simpson, my dear friend and brother.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Austin. My name is Dean Simpson. I'm pastor in a Lutheran church in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. I've been there for around 3.5 years. Interestingly, I was called there as a pastor after the church had split over a question of who would be welcome in our church to preside at our gatherings, a fight over human sexuality, and it became quite exclusive. In fact, it ended up in a big fight in court. And after things settled down, there were a lot of people gone, and they needed somebody to kind of settle things down a little bit, so they called me, not knowing if it would work or not, but we're having a good time. So the topic of inclusion is really interesting to me, and one I can get engaged in because it's pretty close to home to where I work. I'm proud of the people at Grace Lutheran Church in Eau Claire, because there are a lot of older people, older than a lot of our churches, and you would think sometimes of older people that they're hesitant to welcome the stranger and other people of other faiths and so on, but not this group. They're really a very inclusive, welcoming group with a generous spirit of hospitality. So I'm blessed to be there as their pastor. This is my friend Rob Wertheimer, whom I've had the pleasure of getting to know over the years. I don't presently need a lawyer, Rob,
Okay.
but if I did, which I don't, but if I did, I would go to this gentleman, because from what I've come to know of Rob Wertheimer, I would trust him, and I would trust myself and my family and my future into his hands. So it's a privilege for us, Con and I, to be here with you, Rob. So
Thank you so much,
take it
Dean. I
away.
appreciate that. My name is Rob Wertheimer. I'm a lawyer in downtown Hudson. I've been doing that for over 25 years now. I grew up in New York City in a German Jewish section of Upper Manhattan called Washington Heights. I am the son of a Holocaust survivor and a grandson of a person that would perished in the Holocaust. And so our story of inclusion and non-inclusion cuts very close to our family as well. And we can talk about this further, but how it was very hard for a lot of my family and other families to even get into the United States when they wanted to during World War II, and eventually my mom got here after World War II. But in any case, I'm happy to be here, and thank you.
Well, thank you. The topic of inclusion, as we're conversing about this today here in Hudson, the local newspaper, the issue that came out today, has a couple of lengthy articles in it about just this topic. I told my spouse, I think the authors of these articles will receive some sort of an award for investigative reporting. They're really good articles. They point out that, unfortunately, in this small city of Hudson, we are in the midst of an increasing divide between the citizens of Hudson that started predominantly around an issue that's now over a year old, where the local Roman Catholic Church, St. Patrick's, had been asked to bring in some Syrian, a couple of families of Syrian origin. And it ended up in quite an uproar with the Lutheran Social Services being asked to take over the responsibility for it, and the families ultimately ended up in Milwaukee because there are better services there than here. But in the midst of that, a citizens group developed called the Citizens for St. Croix County that became concerned about such things as what was taught about Islam in the high school curriculum, about Sharia law, all these kinds of things that started to raise people's concerns about how many people we keep out of Hudson rather than how many we keep in. It ultimately ended at the point sort of where we are now, and maybe it's a new beginning, where this group was identified by the Southern Poverty Law Group as a hate group. So Hudson has its own officially proclaimed hate group, unfortunately now, and another group called the Hudson Inclusion Group that are working at opposite ends of a cultural pole and trying to come together somehow for a common good. So we are in the midst of it here. We're in the midst of it in the world. Just this morning, the news was that the European Union finally said, we don't want to have anything to do with the United States anymore. We can't count on them. We got to go on our own. So we excluded them, and then they excluded us. And so we're in a general mess on the planet right now in terms of, again, dividing walls to separate people out. My question is, there is, I speak as a sociologist now, 2 decades ago, a concept called the Homogeneous Principle. It's a very simple one. It just says that people are more likely to hang out with people of like mind. It's more comfortable. We choose people like ourselves. So if that is a part of the human condition, and if you think back in the history of each of our religions, we have all spent too much time and given too many lives in the cause of keeping people out rather than inviting them in. What is the essence of each of these three faiths? What's the essence of what they say about a definition of outsiders, strangers, and what each of your religions are to do in terms of dealing with strangers, outsiders? And I think since it's Ramadan, we should start with Askan. Do you think so, the rest of you?
Sure.
Okay, so my sugar level is kind of low tonight, but I try to do my best and converse about the issue. I did some little research. I mean, I'm not really a scholar in this area like my dear brother Dean, and he knows a lot more. So I had to do some research about being a stranger. What is being a stranger, and how does Islam consider being a stranger, and in the inclusion, and there's. I believe I just should start with the definition of strange. So who is a stranger? So when we come with a formal definition, someone who doesn't belong to a place, a family, or a household is a stranger. Like, I'm a stranger here because if you consider me as an immigrant 13 years ago, coming in here and trying to establish an existence here, I could be considered as a stranger according to this definition. A person whom one does not know. A person who is neither a friend nor acquaintance. That's right. I mean, not much is known about Islam or a Muslim or someone who comes from somewhere else. So if we don't know, is strange, but does it mean that we have to exclude this person because we don't know anything about this person, or we have false perceptions about this person? Again, or an outsider. So giving this definition, a stranger in Islam is actually, so when I read this hadith of our beloved Prophet Muhammad, he says, Islam began as something strange, and it shall return to being something strange. To give glad tidings to the strangers. It was asked to him, who are those strangers, O Messenger of God? He replied, those that correct the people when they become corrupt. In another narration, he said in response to the same question, they are a small group of people among a large evil population. Those who oppose them are more than those who follow them. So which means there's strangers, and Islam considers Muslims as strangers, because in an ideal Muslim practice, a Muslim should be upright, should be outspoken, should represent the truth, which the faith is about truth. So a Muslim should stand up for the rights of others and kind of tell people who are corrupt or not doing the right thing that they are wrong. So when you do so, then you're a stranger because you don't fit to the vast majority of population. So this is how our Prophet considers a Muslim in Islam, being strange. And when you look back, all the prophets we know, I mean, starting from Noah, I exclude Adam, starting from Noah, they preached the word of God to his people, and he was rejected and mocked. Prophet Abraham, Noah, persecuted and humiliated. Moses was rejected by not only the Pharaoh, but also by his own people, when they reject his call and worship the golden calf instead of God. And even Jesus and his disciples were ridiculed by the population because they told people to worship one God. Now we're looking here, we all are strangers right now, the four of us, because we believe in one God, and we at least try to tell people to worship one God, and we're strangers. Because worshiping one God means obeying to God and what he tells us to do, and excluding others who are not like us is not one of us. I mean, so in terms of strangers, there's different, as a traveler, for example, Islam says that righteous is not that you turn your face toward the east and west, but true righteousness is one who believes in Allah, God, the last day, the angels, the book, and the prophets, and give wealth in spite of love for it to relatives, orphans, the needy, and the travelers, the strangers. So the strangers who don't belong to a particular location are told to be who need special care. Not just love, but also you have to give away some wealth if they need. So this is the perception of stranger in Islam. And when we look at a stranger in terms of a non-believer, not believing in Islam the way Muslims believe, it's very straightforward. You say salam to a stranger who is not considered being a Muslim and say peace be upon you. That's it. That's the only relationship that Islam and the religion of Islam tells Muslims to do. Nothing else. Nothing more, nothing less. If someone is interpreting it differently from Islamic perspective, then they're wrong. So far, yeah.
Well, that gives a lot of conversation starting ability there. Who
I have others. Oh, yeah.
So basically, that really casts a colloquial understanding of what a stranger is into a whole new light, that from the perspective of God, the stranger is essentially the one who is being abused by the powerful, and is struggling in life because of inequities, unfairness, whatever. And it's made up of the people who are trying to live a decent life following God as they understand it, and as such are strange to others.
Yeah,
Basically,
very well
that's it.
summarized. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Pastor Simpson, what do you think?
Well, since I'm such a scholar,
You are.
that was a much more scholarly presentation than I'd be prepared to make. But interesting. I wanted to follow up, Dan, on something you said, the homogeneous principle.
Mm-hmm.
When I was in seminary, at Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, California, there was a man there, kind of the grandfather of the church growth movement in the 60s and 70s, Don McGavran.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote books about the homogeneous unit principle.
Mm-hmm.
Say, okay, human beings like to gather together with like people. And so let's use that, he said, instead of constantly trying to fight that, let's use that to build the church, because he said the church grows through people movements, because people go to congregate with people just like them. So if you want to build a church, go and begin to attract people like you in any given area. He came in under a lot of criticism for that, because then you just seem to further separate peoples into little groups. But McGavran said no. He said this is how people become empowered, is by hanging out with their own folks. So the Jewish people get together in the area, and if they're free to pursue their lives together, they empower one another. And this was his argument against those who criticized the homogeneous unit principle of church growth. So, he wanted to empower people groups rather than disempower them. To his credit, so the interesting conversation at Fuller Seminary was, in the theological department, was those who wanted to sort of exclude Don McGavran and his homogeneous unit principle followers and sort of make them into heretics, and they were sort of being caught trying to be inclusive by being exclusive. This is really tricky stuff.
Yeah.
Inclusive and exclusive, and this is good stuff for a lawyer to take, and finally, hew the concepts and examine them carefully, because we can become exclusive in our supposed inclusivity, and there are a lot of people being charged with that in our own day politically. The left wants to be inclusive, and they end up being charged with being exclusive of people who don't think like them. So all I wanted to add, really, other than that little comment about the homogeneous principle, and that's kind of how we tend to be, is that I think that at the heart of exclusion is fear. Fear of what we don't know about the other. You never know what those people will do because they're not like us. And so our suspicions are based on our fear and our anxieties about them. And so the scriptures, I think, of all of our traditions come with a clear charge to do not be afraid. Fear not, for I am with you. I think that's common to all our three traditions. Which God, I think said to Abraham when the angel shows up, it's always kind of scary, and God has to say, relax, don't be afraid. I'm here to bless you. And indeed, we find in the stranger who comes into our midst a source of great blessing if we're open to them. And that cuts against our natural human fears, our tendency to gather together with our own people like us. And if there's ever going to be peace in the world, I think we're going to have to dare to step outside of our comfort zones and begin welcoming the other, the stranger, and in them will meet God. So I just wanted to chip in with that here at the start.
Thank you. Can you clarify at all for us?
Well, I agree with what Dean, well, also what Oskan's saying, but what Dean's saying too, as far as the fear is what causes the separateness and the being afraid of the stranger and the unknown. And in Judaism, it's a pretty basic tenet as part of Passover and the Seder, which we just celebrated in April, is the main tenet of Passover is that the slaves were freed from Egypt. And in Exodus it says, "You shall not oppress a stranger, since you yourselves know the feelings of a stranger, for you also were strangers and slaves in the land of Egypt." And then Leviticus says, "The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as a native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you are aliens in the land of Egypt. I am your Lord, your God." So it points to the fact that we as Jews are strangers and therefore must welcome them in our home and must take care of them. And this commandment to care for the stranger is mentioned more times than any other commandment in the Torah, more even than the command to love God. And Exodus, again, "You shall not wrong nor oppress the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And the strangers who reside with you shall be to you as your citizens, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt," a recurring theme. That's even in Leviticus. And so what the rabbis teach is that as Jews who know the suffering of the oppressed, we are especially obligated to reach out to the strangers in our midst. And we are equally obligated not to ignore the cry of the oppressed elsewhere, but to welcome those who flee the horrors of tyranny and persecution. And the stranger is a human construct, not a divine one. And sometimes a stranger is just someone you haven't said hello to yet or haven't made the effort to welcome into your world. And so I think it's a basic tenet of Judaism because we were slaves, because we were strangers, because we have in many respects still are the outsiders, that we welcome them as well and not be afraid of them and not cast them out, but to welcome them in. And that's why, the whole things going on these days with keeping strangers out and keeping, like when the Syrians wanted to come or whoever, I'm always reminded growing up in New York of the Statue of Liberty that is supposed to be welcoming into the harbor of New York, and just how far we've come from that, and how they're talking now about separating children from their families. And we're just moving in such a different direction from what all this says. It's just, it's upsetting. And I mentioned earlier how my mother and her family wanted to come to America during World War II, and we had quotas. The U.S. had quotas back then for a certain number of people from depending on which country you were coming from, and so there wasn't completely open immigration either back then. And a lot of people perished because of that. And obviously, I think we need to allow people to come into this country, especially when they're being oppressed from where they're coming from. And it is, it's real easy to stick to what you're comfortable with and what you know. And like Dean said, it's the fear of the unknown. It's the fear of this stranger, and we have to move past that and to welcome the stranger, because it's just a construct. We've decided that in some way they're different, and we don't like different.
So Oskan, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I totally concur with what you have said, and I still want to add something about us all being strangers. When I consider our creation as a humankind, we don't belong to this earth. We came from God. He breathed upon this body his soul. So we don't belong here. So we are travelers here. That's what the prophet tries to say. It doesn't matter whether we're Christians, Jews, non-believers, Muslims. We are travelers. We don't belong here. Where we belong is a place with God, next to him in heaven. So how dare we claim possession to this earth, to this piece of land? It could be Turkey, the US, whatever, and say it belongs to us, no one else, which It's not true. It belongs to God. Everything belongs to Him. He gave us the opportunity to pass here, to stay here for a while, to live our lives and prepare for the hereafter. If we consider our lives like that, no one is a stranger, but all of us are strangers. So we should treat each other that way. And that's what I really don't understand. And Muhammad says, live in this world as though you are a stranger or a wayfarer. It reminds us to live our lives as if we are travelers at a way stop, waiting for God to call us to home, to our final abode. That's what it is. We're going to be called on, and we're going to be leaving. So what is it we can't share? What is it we say we exclude you? It's really a shame on us, the whole humankind, that we treat each other like that way, where our divine religions tell us that we shouldn't because we're part of Him. And inclusiveness. Islam is all inclusive. The reason is because the universe, according to Islam, is surrendering to the will of God. It does what God tells the universe to do. We're expanding, the stars are expanding, the earth is changing, and it is obeying the will of God, all the creatures, but the humankind. The reason we have a will, we have a choice to obey and not to obey. If we choose to obey, we have to be inclusive. If we don't obey, then we disregard God. That's what it is. And that's the only measurement I'm having. It doesn't matter whether this person considers himself or herself as a Muslim, Christian, non-belief, whatever it is. If we don't obey God and consider this world ours and exclude others, so everyone, even before Islam, was in God's religion. They were told to worship God in a certain way. Abraham, starting Moses, David, and the way of understanding that God is one and obeying by surrendering to Him, that's Islam and nothing else. And sometimes, and I try not to be upset, but more concerned and feel sorry for these people who exclude others and who think that they own this world. It's not the case. No. We're all strangers.
So I read this morning, I think, that about 23% of the world's population is celebrating Ramadan right now. 34% of the world's population is Christian. 2 to 2.5% is Jewish. Combined, over half of the world's population ascribes to the principles that the three of you have just enunciated.
Yeah.
So what is happening when we are in the majority in terms of ideology about how we treat strangers, that we're in so much mischief all the time? Can you explain that? Which of you are at fault for that?
Yes.
Yeah. We're not walking the talk. We're talking it, we're not walking it. Back to the place of fear in our lives. Fear not is a command. We can't turn away from the things we fear by ourselves. We need help. We need one another to do that. We need the help that God sends in God's messengers, one another. We need the community. So that in the Christian tradition, that's why we, has revered the saints, because those people who live among us as examples to give us courage and to encourage us to live as we ought to live. So we confess our sins and our failures. And the refusal to confess sin and failure is to, as Pharaoh did against the children of Israel, to harden his heart against them, even though the word was there calling him out of that to mercy tenderness. If we refuse to see our wrong and our error, then we harden our heart against that word of the Lord to turn. And interestingly, the more we harden our heart, the more religious we become about it. And so you kind of got a religious impulse toward mercy and inclusiveness and welcoming the stranger. And you have a parody of that religious impulse, a false religious impulse, we could say, to define others out of God's grace and mercy and ourselves as the only blessed ones. And it parades around like a wolf in sheep's clothing. It parades around. It uses all the same words of God and Moses and Jesus and Muhammad. It's got the outer trappings, all the looks of religion, but inside it's dead men's bones, Jesus says. It's a make-believe religion. So it's a difficult position in which we find ourselves, and if we're not careful, we easily fall into the camp. As soon as we begin pointing the finger, we got to be careful. There are three more pointing back at ourselves, like the old gospel song says, it's me, O Lord, not my brother, not my sister, but it's me, standing in the need of prayer. So this confession of sin is really central to all our communities of faith. The prophets call us to it. Muhammad called his people to it, and Jesus and the apostles call us to own up to the truth about ourselves and say, yeah, I am afraid. And I am walking in fear right now. And that's the beginning of healing.
So, given the circumstances, let's just localize it to Hudson and environs. What are some things that you would commend the citizens of this area to do to try and break down barriers before they get so difficult to break down that they're almost impossible? The outward manifestation of these divisions, which have been with the human condition since creation, have gotten much more intense now. What can we do in this area, in your judgment, to try to mitigate against that kind of behavior, which violates not only our religious principles, it violates our constitutional principles, our government of laws. And so the violation is significant in our little city and in our country. What can we do to break it down?
I think in Hudson, I think it does come to the strangers, just someone you haven't said hello to yet. I think a lot of the fear, prejudice, and is a lot of fear of the unknown. It's different, like, when I grew up in New York, there were people that didn't like certain minorities, and they had been mugged and robbed, and not that it was right to generalize, but they had a direct type of thing. And I think more in the small towns in this area and in Hudson, it's more of something you just don't know. It's the unknown. And so, something like what we do on this level, but maybe even on a bigger level, is to have people get together. And it's like when the police officers go around to the big cities and they get to know the neighborhood, and they're knowing who they're dealing with, as opposed to dealing with these people that it's us against them. So I think, I'm wondering how many people had actually met Syrians who were totally opposed to having them come to Hudson, or just immigration in general. It's a fear again. They're afraid that they're either going to lose their jobs, or they're going to be terrorists, or they're going to rob them, or somehow take something from them that's sacred to them. And so I think it is just a matter of knowing the unknown. And once they get to see that they're just people like us who are in need of a place to be. And, and the thing about us here in America is that everyone was an immigrant at some point. And people seem to forget that even if your ancestors came over on the Mayflower, they still came from Europe and didn't originate here. And so I think the first step is getting to know the other and the stranger.
I couldn't agree more, Rob. I think that's really central. I'm thinking of a verse in the letter to the Corinthian church by St. Paul. He said, if I speak in the tongues of people and angels but have no love. I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. There's so much talk going on.
Yeah.
And if you notice, an awful lot of it is talk about the other. What you're suggesting is we ought to talk to the other. Before we talk about someone, we ought to talk to them. And we could begin to practice that in discipline ourselves. As soon as we catch ourselves talking about anyone, even members of our own family or somebody at work or school, catch ourselves talking about them and zip it and go and talk to them and listen to them. And begin that discipline of more face-to-face kind of encounters instead of just paying attention to all the noise, the clanging cymbals, and the gonging going on around us. It would make a difference.
So may I ask a question? I mean, when you said talking about them without knowing about them, who is starting that conversation about others without the others? And what are the talks going around? Who is starting it? Where is this conversation happening? Can I ask a legit question? Is it here? Is it in the pubs? Where in the bar? Where is it?
It's easy for us to talk about the stranger that we don't know anything about, but in fact, the strangers that are closest to us are in our midst. They're our color, they're our ethnicity, they're our religion, they're us. And in some ways, it's easier almost, I think, to talk to somebody who is dissimilar to us in terms of ethnicity, race, whatever, than it is to talk to our own kind who are violating our own principles.
Yeah. And Dan, I'd add to that in the country, we're the majority of us white Anglo-Saxon, the white European descent people, we're divided left and right as well.
Mm-hmm.
And we talk about each other, and we get on Facebook and we troll one another, and we participate in the noise and we need to start where we're at. We may never we may never have the privilege of knowing face to face a Muslim man from Turkey, like it's been my privilege to get to know my brother Özkan.
Yeah.
I may never have had the opportunity, and what a pleasure it's been, and what a ongoing delight it is to know both of these guys face to face. But if I never get that opportunity, we need to treat our own people with the same sort of respect we would hope they would show to us. So again, we're back to one of the primary tenets of all of our faith is do unto others what you'd have them do to you. I think that's a central teaching of our three religious traditions, and indeed all the world's religions. So it begins here, talking to myself.
So in answer to Özkan's question, in terms of the local situation, the conversation started within the Christian community. It divided over some
churches,
Christians
right?
who wanted to bring in some non-Christian Muslims and others who did not. And it just has sort of gotten out of hand, I think, because none of us are starting at the entry point of the discussion, which is exactly what you said. There's only one planet. We all confess it was created by God, that Christians have a hymn that they sing vigorously saying, "I'm but a stranger here, heaven is my home." Did you ever sing that? Remember singing that?
I heard it the first time. Okay.
And it's based on a Bible passage
Yeah.
that is the same, that we're called strangers and wanderers in a foreign land. That's who we all are. We don't own the planet. It's not ours. We're stewards of it. We're given use of it, take
Yes.
care of it, pass it on, better shape to the next.
Yeah.
But somehow we all are so egocentric that we think our little space is sacred to us. It's ours to do with that as we want. And how do you break through that, especially in a culture that of all the Western cultures in the world, only a minority of the inhabitants of this country have ever traveled outside the country. And in fact, a majority have rarely gone beyond a couple of of 100 miles of where they are born. So we think we are sort of the center of the universe when in fact we are pretty closed in terms of our view of the world, the planet, and the peoples in it. So
I'd like to say a word about that question you raised, Ozkan, too. Where's this conversation going on? Because it's sort of all pervasive. It's all over the world right now. But it happens, it starts in little comments that sound sort of innocuous almost. It's just like a little spark of defining someone as other, and well, you never know what they might do. And then somebody adds a little comment to it, and it's like fanning the spark a little bit until it comes into a little flame. And then we all start joining in, and we fan those flames, and pretty soon it's a raging fire, which is an image of James in the book of James, that the tongue is like a fire set on. It's set aflame by the fires of hell. Watch your tongue. So I don't know if any of us are completely absolved. Probably we all are guilty to some extent. But there's a saying of Luther. He said, you can't help noticing the birds flying by, which is the temptations, and you sometimes notice them and welcome them, but you don't have to let them build a nest in your hair, he said. So when we catch ourselves, we can quickly repent. There's a story in the Song of Solomon, the story about how to nurture a love, and the author says, let's catch the little foxes that ruin the vineyard. And it's an image of these little tiny animals, and they don't do much damage, one or two of them. So you catch them quickly and take them out of the vineyard, because if you let them go, they'll multiply, and pretty soon they'll destroy the vineyard. And it's those little words, little actions, we find ourselves fanning the flames and participating in this conversation rather than putting the brakes on. And so, I don't know, I think the conversation started a long, long time ago. And again, the story in Genesis of the serpent saying to our first mother, did God say, you can't have any of the fruit? Fanning the fears and the suspicions of loss. Did God say you're not going to get to eat any of this fruit? And begins to fan the flames of fear. And so the conversation started a long time ago. We're born into this conversation, I'm afraid. But we don't have to participate in it. When we begin to realize our participation, we can, as all of our religious teachers have taught us, we can turn away, we can repent, and walk in a spiritual path instead.
So, Ozkan, is that the conversation has gone on close to an hour, so we'll have to draw it to a close.
Okay.
But the conversation, is it a summary of what Ramadan is all about?
So yes, so when I kind of summarize and what you said, this conversation that inflames the whole, this city and other cities can happen anywhere, in a Christian community, Muslim community, or Jewish community. I think what we really need to be doing as individuals in those communities, and not to allow to inflame and spread and prevail those negative aspects of excluding others, is you have to be self-reflective. The month of Ramadan is a good opportunity for Muslims to reflect on what they did, what they could have done, and what they didn't do in terms of their faith and what God prescribes them to do. Because we know God has created us, and He has delivered us with manuals. It's the Torah, it's the Zabur, it's the Bible, it's the Quran. Those are the manuals for us to tell us how to treat ourselves internally, and how to treat others, and how to live together, and how to treat our environment. Those are manuals. God prescribed us. And now it's time to reflect and say, how much and how do I obey and use those prescriptions and follow those prescriptions. Is it 100%? If it was 100%, we didn't have all these issues. So it's not 100%. I mean, I'm self-critical right now. So what is it then? Is it 5%, 10%? So it's a time to reflect and to better yourself by saying, I've really, if I'm very sincere, I failed, and I can only hope for the mercy of God, to get to heaven. Otherwise, I don't deserve it. If we as individuals think about ourselves, I really don't deserve heaven because I failed, and it's only my hope in God's mercy that will save me, then we're in a good path. That's my conclusion.
Any other final comments from the two of you?
I guess I always just like to end on a string of hope that at some point we will be able to get together and talk to the stranger, at least, and to just even on a local level, it shouldn't be this disrupted on a local level. So hopefully we can get together, that both sides can at least move towards a better understanding of the stranger and the other. So I just want to be hopeful.
Good word. Good
Thank you.
word, Rob.
Dean, anything else?
Lord, have mercy.
Lord, have mercy.
Yeah.
Well,
Amen.
to those of you who have spent this time watching with us and listening to our discussion, and recognizing that as in all cases, change begins on a personal level, we would just encourage you, as we try to encourage ourselves, not only during this time of Ramadan, but for all of our religions. We're constantly called to examine ourselves and see how our behavior comports with the God that we have expressed our confidence in and love for and desire to follow, and to seek to make sure our own behaviors more and more each day are in sync with the kind of behaviors to which our gods call us. And in each case, that's to recognize our sisterhood and brotherhood as children of the same God, sharing the same planet that He gave for all of us to share, loving us all equally, ascribing equal equal love, care, and worth to each of us, and a desire for each of us to have the ability to live out our lives in love and care and service to others to the best of our ability. Toward that basic value, we offer this conversation today. Hope it will lead each of us to introspection that we have been called to observe today, and wishing all of us the many blessings of peace, joy, happiness, and sisterhood and brotherhood that are a part of our traditions. To that end, we give you thanks again for listening to us, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon, we hope. Goodbye now.